welcome back to another episode of Consumer Says with Morning Consult Economic Intelligence. I'm Sophia and I'm joined here by my colleague Denny. Hi Denny, how are you doing?
Hi, Sophia. I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good. Before we get into it, I wanted to do a little bit of housekeeping. First of all, you all might have noticed that our regular co-host Kayla has is once again not here, and that's because she's on maternity leave. So we're very happy for her, and she will be back, so don't fret. But that's why she hasn't been in the past couple of episodes. But luckily, we have Denny to join us here today. And later on in the episode, we're going to be talking to Amy on our industry analyst team. And she's going to get into their recent report on GenZers, and we'll talk about how the Gen Z consumer is unique from others and what's going on in that part of the economy and world, consumer world. So that's what we have going on later today, or later in this episode. And then also, if you haven't yet, please subscribe to our email newsletter, which I always put a link in the description. It's called the Economic Pulse Check. It goes along with this podcast and has a little bit more information on the memos we reference and bullet points on what's going on in the economy and in our latest research here at Morning Consult. So you don't want to miss that. But that's just all we have today for housekeeping. And then I think we're going to get into now just a temperature check. We haven't done a temperature check in a while on the overall state of the economy. So there's been a lot of data that has come in the past few weeks. So we kind of wanted to do another touch point on the overall state of the economy. So Denny, do you want to kick us off here and give us a weather temperature read on where we are in the economy in the United States right now?
I always like this part. And for this version, we're doing like a sort of looking at the broader picture because, we're towards the end of the month now. There's a lot of data out compared to the previous recording where we focused more on the index of consumer sentiment. I would say the temperature right now is around 65 or so. And again, as a reminder, 68 to 70 is that great temperature, as we like to call it. So we're a little bit below that right now, and we'll get to it. There's a lot of different indicators that we've looked at to come to that sort of conclusion, and it will range from spending to inflation to producer price indexes, labor, tariff threats, etc. It just doesn't seem like we are at that 68 that we were a couple of months ago.
Yeah, things are looking a little bit gloomier than they were a couple months ago based on some of the data we've come in. Do we want to start with sentiment since that might be fresh in our listeners' minds since we talked about that last episode?
Yes, we focused quite a bit on index of consumer sentiment in the last episode. We looked at particularly the period between post inauguration and February 4th, where we've sort of seen a consistent downward trend in index of consumer sentiment. I've looked at the data between February 4th and today, and we've seen the general volatility, a little bit of an up and down, but where we ended up is that February 4th figure, give or take, which is lower than, what we have seen since November. That upward momentum that we had in consumer sentiment is not there. We haven't sustained that downward momentum in sentiment, but we're sort of in a pause and wait situation on there. Certainly that ticks down the overall temperature a little bit, because we were used to a higher level of sentiment.
Yeah, so the honeymoon period is definitely over now that we have a new administration, but it didn't continue to tank as it did in the week during and after inauguration. So it seems like it's a little bit more tentative now. Markets have rebounded a bit as well, so that could be part of why it's not getting more negative. But that we definitely want to keep our eyes on that because we still are in a wait and see period with, you kind of referenced this in your intro, tariffs. We still don't know exactly which tariffs are going to go into place. And then we did also get inflation data that came in between the last time we talked and now. So that was the CPI inflation. So that came in hotter than expected, and that I'm sure is also going into your measurement of a slightly less rosy economy. So, what's going on with inflation right now?
So after our recording, we had two more inflation measures that come out, the consumer price index, producer price index. Market expectations are generally, I would say, quite accurate when we look into these indices, especially a few days before. And there was a bit of a surprise. The both the CPI and PPI came in higher than expected. And the next release that we like to focus on, the retail sales, also came in lower than expected. So there's been sort of this, continuous data releases that surprised the market watchers to the side that they weren't really quite happy about, obviously.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
so I think that the combination of those certainly factored into this reading of 65. Um, eh, the temperature did not tank because there's not a bit of a shooting happening in, both the CPI or the PPI and even, the downward turn in retail sales. That's why we didn't really move the needle as much. But we sort of, cautiously looking at it, a bit more caution around that, a bit more worried
Yeah.
about where.
For me personally, I didn't like seeing the three number in the year over year inflation line because we were creeping quite close to 2%, which is the
That's
Fed's
right.
target, but now we're back up to three. And I think the big thing that we're watching here on the econ team is how inflation will go moving forward. This hotter than expected read isn't the end of the world, as you mentioned, and there were some things like vehicle insurance was a large part of it, and shelter was a large part of it. So it's not an overall widespread increase in prices, which is good news. But then we've done a lot of research in the past few weeks about how goods inflation might not be a helper as much as it's been. So that could be putting upward pressure on future reads going forward, which isn't great for the consumer because of our price sensitivity index. So before we move on to Amy, do we want to talk a little bit about our price sensitivity index and what that has to do with this as well?
Yeah, so a lot of our data goes in conjunction with the government data, and they're very complementary in nature. And our inflation and supply chains tracker, we updated it this month. We have recorded a price sensitivity index level that at an all-time high. And again, what price sensitivity measures is that relative share of those who walk away from a purchase when they encounter a price that is higher than expected. It's a very actionable measure, I feel like. So the feel that, consumers are walking away from purchases because the prices are high is certainly concerning for us. We also have another measure called the price surprise. It measures, again, the relative share of those who are surprised by the price that they see. We do see that people are not as surprised as earlier. But that doesn't change the fact that they are still walking away from purchases, which makes me think it's really the price levels that are in top of mind for the consumer. And that is concerning for spending, as we see this increasing share of those walking away from purchases. Um,
Especially if we do see price increases, even if we don't get widespread tariffs like have been proposed, we could see those in specific sectors, and those sectors could be hurt, especially by the way that consumers are more price sensitive than before. Because if they do run into, a higher than expected car price, for example, because of auto tariffs, they might just not be willing to deal with it more today than they were a couple years ago.
Exactly, exactly. And again, this doesn't come after a period of low inflation. These tariffs come after a period of fairly um, robust inflation readings for the car prices. So it would definitely affect consumers.
I would say
Yeah, so
one bright spot is the labor market to give us, so we've been talking about a lot of bad news, but the unemployment rate is still super low. And we have mentioned in a lot of our data and research that it's harder to find a job if you've lost your job. So that's unfortunate for folks who are locked out of the labor market, but in general, the labor market is pretty tight, pretty robust, and there's been minimal layoffs. And so for now, I think that is a bright spot in the economy. And inflation, it's not rearing its ugly head back again. It's just in the danger zone. So
Definitely in the danger zone. And I would say the same thing about the retail sales, right? Like the retail sales number came in lower than expected. That surprised and folks. But it could be tied to a lot of things, especially the weather, this being in January, wildfires in West Coast, very cold temperatures in southern United States. It that does have an effect on people's shopping behavior. So month over month, it did drop. Year over year, it's still not bad, especially looking at certain categories. And this comes after a revised up number, in December. So, what we have seen in our data and Morning Consult side is that the spending that has happened in January is more towards essential spending rather than discretionary spending, which sort of falls in line. After the holiday period, people focused a little bit more on the essentials that they needed in the winter months. So as the new year began, a bit of a mixed signal on the spending side, but it's too soon to, as you just said, to call it, um, a risky, sort of a red zone situation. Um, One caveat I'm gonna throw back at you on the labor side, though, is, it's a very nuanced picture, I think. At an aggregate level, as you mentioned, things look good, but if you don't have a job, it's really tough. And there's also, you've mentioned before, the government layoffs that are in effect that may have some, pain points in certain regions. Um, you know, Again, it's too soon to tell in the numbers right now, but we have been reading the news of these layoffs taking place. So that sort of, might pop up in the numbers, perhaps not at the top line number, but in sort of regional numbers.
yeah. And the upper end of that, that's a great point. I should have brought that up, but the upper end of that estimate is 200,000-ish, give or take. So that's a lot of people that if they end up truly being out of a job, and that could be a mini shock. It could even reach the top line number, but certainly could affect regional areas. And not just Washington, D.C., there's a bunch of government workers in other states like New Mexico, even California. So all over the country, really. So we'll just have to see. Again, I mean, we leave it many times. We leave it as a wait and see, but that's where we are today, and that's why we continue to do our temperature checks, and they move up and down. So thanks for that assessment. I think that we will move on to chatting with Amy, and yeah, thanks for joining today, Denny. Hello, I'm here with Amy He, the head of industry analysis. Thank you for joining, Amy. We're going to talk about today your latest report, The Forces Shaping Gen Z, Friends, Fitness, Finance. There's lots of clever sayings you have woven into that report. I'm really excited to get into it with you because we do on the econ side a lot of research into Gen Z consumers and how they act and what they're thinking, but on the industry side, you get more into the psychology of it and more the overall picture of who the Gen Z person and consumer is. So I'm really excited to get your perspective. Before we get into the finance part of the report, which is what we're going to focus on mostly today, since this is an economics podcast, I did want to get just your overall, what were your main findings from the report and what really jumped out at you from the survey information that you collected?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on. Really excited. Long time listener, first time caller. My team here at Morning Consult, we do a lot of Gen Z research, just like your team does, but we try to capture a lot more of the vibes, I would say. We previously have a lot of data and context behind, how Gen Z shops, how they travel, how they eat and drink. But for this report that we just published, we really wanted to capture like the feeling that Gen Z is going through right now, because it's become pretty evident over the last few years, I would say, in looking at Gen Z that There's a general sense of malaise in the generation. They're just not hitting the same traditional milestones that their predecessors did. And they're thinking about culture and the world really differently. And that's translating to some real shifts that we've been seeing and documenting, such as their shift in ideology towards the right, the way that they're using shopping as a way to cope with the world, their constant pursuit of self optimization and wellness. So this report is really about trying to quantify some of those feelings. And we looked at three broad buckets, which are Gen Z's feelings about their health and wellness, their friends and family, and then the way they think about money and shopping. And I have to say that the overall takeaways felt a little depressing to me. I don't think that we expected the picture to be super optimistic, but even I was a little bit surprised at how bleak some of the data was. So, one big takeaway is that there's a pretty big gender gap among Gen Z men and women. Women are just much more likely to say they are anxious, feeling lonely, are less confident about their financial futures than men are. I think that there's almost been a media obsession with how Gen Z men are doing, how they feel, what they're up to. And for a long time, we've gotten this picture that like solving this Gen Z men puzzle would explain and unlock so much because they're so unhappy. But our data finds that Gen Z women are just as likely, if not more, to be feeling negatively about many aspects of their lives. And that's quite undercovered, in my opinion. A second takeaway is that Gen Z feels stuck when it comes to friends and community. They're happy with their current state of friendships, but they're also having trouble making deeper connections or making new friends. And they're more likely to say, compared to the rest of the population, that they are feeling lonely overall. And again, there's a gender angle here with women more likely than men to say that they feel lonely. And then a final takeaway that stuck out to me on spending and money specifically is that we're really seeing a generation of doom spenders in action. I think both Gen Z and millennials are big shoppers overall, but I think a big difference is that Gen Z just doesn't have as much purchasing power at the moment as millennials do because of where they are in this stage in their lives. And yet they're still spending a lot of their money on non essentials, which potentially has a big impact down the road, I would say.
Thanks so much for that. I agree with you. I've seen a lot about Gen Z men and how they feel isolated and lonely, and not so much about Gen Z women. So it's really interesting that you found that, but it actually intuitively makes a lot of sense. If we see this problem with men, why wouldn't we also see it with women? And they're also, especially younger women, more susceptible to some of the pressures of social media in a different way than men that can also drag down the psyche. I think malaise is a really good word to summarize a lot of what you just said. But since we are going to get into the finance side, I did want to dig into more of this doom spending term that you mentioned, and wanted to ask you what is doom spending and what does that mean, and what are you seeing in the data when it comes to doom spending?
Yeah, so doom spending is, I mean, a term that I feel like really originated on TikTok, so as so many other Gen Z related trends, but it's basically when you mindlessly shop in order to feel better, or you feel like you're not going to achieve any of your life goals anyway, so why not just buy stuff now that will make you feel better? And it's sort of nihilistic, right? I saw the other day a video clip of a podcast recording on TikTok where the host was like, "Oh, rent is due, but your friend just invited you to go skiing. Do it. Go into debt. Why not? Who cares? The world is on fire anyway." And obviously, that was said with a lot of heavy sarcasm and as a joke. But also at the same time, you as a viewer know that it was said with the idea that if you did actually do something like that, it's totally understandable because can you believe what's happening in the world? And I think that Gen Z is so strongly associated with doom spending because they really do embody the just treat yourself mindset. And they've really grown up in the last few years with nothing but unprecedented times and have turned to capitalism and shopping as a way to escape and cope because it's one of the few things that they feel like they can control. And the data that we were trying to capture was whether or not Gen Zers feel like they overspend. So we asked them how often they feel like they spend too much money. And 61% reported overspending always or sometimes, with Gen Z men about 12 points more likely to say that this was the case than Gen Z men. And then not only that, we also asked respondents whether they've gone into debt over various types of purchases. And 39% of Gen Z said they've gone into debt over a purchase that made them feel good in the moment. And 33% said they've gone into debt over something that was purchased on an impulse. Even the tested option that had the smallest share of respondents, so something recommended to me by an influencer, 20% of Gen Z said they've done that and have gone into debt over it. So again, I think if you've been on the corners of the internet where Gen Z hang out, some of this may be anecdotally evident to you, but our research really grounds that with specific numbers and numbers that were way higher than I expected.
It's really interesting hearing you provide the psychological explanation for a lot of this because we have also been seeing this in our econ data in a slightly different way, just more on a top line level. And I just love hearing an explanation for why that might be occurring or what might be driving the differences between these generations. So, for example, we just came out with our quarterly survey on household emergency expenditures and decision making, and one thing that really jumped out at me on the differences between the generation is Gen Zers said that they paid for their emergency expenses less with cash than their other generations. But when we really dig into that, it's not just that they're not paying for it with cash or they're using more debt than they are with their older generations. They're actually just not cutting down on spending. So one of our options there is, did you pay with something in cash? And in order to do that, by cash, I mean cash, debit, or paying off your credit card at the next statement. In order to do that, did you cut down on other spending? Which is, something that you would think of as an obvious choice when you get your car towed or something. Maybe you don't buy something from Sephora that month. But Gen Zers, less than other adults, are not cutting back on other spending when they have emergency expenses. So I found that really interesting. And then another thing that we have seen consistently in our economics data, which really checks out with what you're saying, is that non-essential spending is the highest as a share of their wallet for Gen Zers, and millennials kind of bounce around with them as well, but it's usually Gen Zers who are leading the pack. They're spending like up to 10 percentage points or more of their wallet on non-essential discretionary fund spending than boomers, and Gen Xers even sometimes as well. So they really like to spend on things that are fun, and maybe some of it is coming from this idea of like, why not spend today instead of saving for the future? And I've seen a lot of that online too. Like, what's the point in saving when the world is ending? There's a lot of those ideas that are permeating.
Yeah, and like we have a page in our report that pulls directly from your team's data. So, like share of wallet, like what goes towards housing, what goes towards essentials and then non-essentials, and then also a trend line on non-essentials as a share of their total spending per month, as you had mentioned. And I actually wanted to turn this back on you and ask you a question on this because we didn't feature like data on debt necessarily, but I also like I'm really curious to know like do Gen Z's debt levels, like how do they compare? Is it like a worryingly big percentage of their, total expenses or whatever it may be?
It depends on the kind of debt. It's actually not that much more. They do have more student loans, which makes sense based on their age. And they do take on more debt, like buy now, pay later debt. But because they have less responsibilities, they're less likely to have, millennials are actually the ones who have more debt when it comes to mortgages or auto loans or those big debt purchases. I think that they're more likely to be a little bit more savvy. Instead of just relying on credit cards, they use buy now, pay later. So debt isn't necessarily unique to Gen Zers. It's more that they use different types of debt and might have more of that. Whereas I think millennials are actually the ones who are the most debt saddled, and it kind of makes sense with their time in life that they might be more likely to have families, have houses, and things that are just like more expensive with debt. But I actually, not to turn it around on you again, I actually did want to ask you, and something in the report that was really interesting to me was how Gen Zers, rent and housing is such a big part of the conversation right now in the economic world in terms of the cost of living crisis, as housing is the largest portion of inflation still today. That's preventing us from bringing it down to that Fed target. And it's really a problem because we don't have enough supply and it's just the largest expense for a lot of people. And so I thought it was interesting to see that Gen Zers are approaching this rent problem differently than other generations, and that could be part of the way that they're making room for these non essential discretionary spending instead of taking on debt. So, what are the creative ways, or what's different about Gen Zers that they are able to spend in this way that other generations aren't?
I like that you say creative ways. So we did ask about their housing situations, and the top ranked response on like who the respondents share their household with was with their or their partner's parents. And just to clarify for anyone listening, our sample of Gen Z respondents was like the full Gen Z samples from 13 to I believe 27. Usually in our research, we focus on Gen Z adults, but we felt like for a lot of these questions, particularly on like shopping habits and things like that, we wanted to get a sense of like older Gen Z and younger Gen Z as well, and like friends and community and things like that. But like the whole entire Gen Z sample, 29% said they live with their or their partner's parents. And obviously, that number is probably skewed by the fact that there are younger Gen Z who are just not old enough to live with by themselves or with other people who are not their family. But if you isolated that question just among the older Gen Z sample, even 1 in 4 of older Gen Zers say that they share their household with their parents. And I think that that for me was really an indication that like in our line of work, when we get questions from clients, a lot of people say like, oh, is this unique to Gen Z, or is this just like how every generation was at that point in time? Like if you looked at millennials when they were in their 20s or Gen Xers when they were in their 20s, weren't they going through the same thing? And like partially yes, a lot of these generations went through the same thing at that point in time, and Gen Z is not necessarily like the first generation ever to go through something like this. But I do think that Gen Z are uniquely situated in that they're really living through a time of high cost of living, really competitive job markets, and just like geopolitical conflict that impacts the global economy, that impacts the local economy, things like that. And that's pretty specific to them. So I feel like we are getting to a point with this generation in particular. Like they said, like people said this about millennials too, like, oh, they're not hitting the milestones that boomers and Gen Xers did with like buying houses, getting married, etc. But I do feel like it's even more severe for Gen Z. And I think a lot more of this will pan out in the next couple of years as Gen Z gets even older and are even more likely to, or like they're supposed to hit even more milestones and they're not going to. But like that's really my prediction on some of those like financial independence markers. And I'm curious to know or like hear if you feel like the same way based on looking at like spending data, economic data, and all of those like financial periods and phases in their lives.
Well, one thing that really jumped out at me when you were speaking about this was a stat I saw recently, which is that the median age of first-time home buyers has reached an all-time high of around 38. And so I think that really like captures a lot of what we're talking about here because the median time, like also the median age to first have a child is has gone up to around 30. So everything is moving later, and I think what you're saying that clients are asking, like, isn't this what happened with older generations as well? Like, didn't this happen with millennials? I think the answer is yes, and because yes, it was the case for millennials that they were buying houses later, having kids later, but that trend is just continuing to be pushed out, and it's even later for Gen Zers. So I think that's like part of the picture here is that these financial decisions and purchases are happening later in life or more difficult for them, but that it's part of a larger trend that's been happening for decades now. It's not just them, but it's worse for them, I would say.
Yeah, totally. And the other thing that I wanted to add is that we also ask people whether or not they've taken on like side hustles or like second jobs in order to support their purchases, and that number really like blew me away. Of our entire Gen Z sample, 52% said that they have pursued side hustles to help afford buying non-necessities. And like I want to like non-necessities. People are taking on second jobs or side hustles to buy stuff that they don't need. And this number is pretty consistent across the demographics. So 50% of men said yes, 55% of women said yes, 51% of younger Gen Z said yes, and then 53% of older Gen Z said yes. That's crazy to me. Like, I think there's the debt piece, and then there's like the supplementing income piece of this, and it just like all goes to show that they are getting creative, but like in a way that like makes me feel sad a little bit. Like a lot of like they recognize that a lot of these purchases are not necessary to their life, but like whatever external forces there may be, brand marketing, societal peer pressure, whatever it may be, it's like driving them to really shop and then find new ways in order to afford their shopping habits.
It seems like keeping up with the Joneses has always been a problem, but maybe it's
Yeah.
even more of a problem now for Gen Zers. And I think, in my opinion, it's because of social media, because, like, you've shown in your data that they use TikTok and apps like that more often. It's just so much more visible how people are doing better than you, or have more stuff than you, or have cooler stuff than you. And so that could be like part of the reason why they're driven to take on these extra side hustles or jobs just to keep up with appearances or feel like they have what other people have. And yeah, it is a little bit sad. But they are crafty, and we do live in a different world in the economy now, where there's different ways to make money and have multiple income streams. So not all sad. Before before we leave, this has been a great discussion. Thanks so much. I want to leave you with a little bit of like an open-ended on fearless forecast, or where you see things going. Gen Zers are starting to age into their prime working years. As you mentioned, this survey included a lot of the younger Gen Zers who are living at home. Obviously, this doesn't include them, but as they are aging into their prime working years, how do you see these trends developing, and how it might affect, you know, I mean, I know you're in the industry side, but like the overall economy, or just maybe just their consumption habits in general?
Yeah. So I think from a sociological perspective, we're seeing a generation that's being raised on shopping as a means to self-soothe, which I want to say on net for the population is probably not great. But I think as long as economic and political uncertainty continues in the way that it has over the last 10 years, we're probably going to keep seeing that. Um, I'm not an economist, but I am on an economist team's podcast. But I'll venture to say that I think Gen Z will continue to spend in ways that are potentially detrimental to their financial health. We ask a couple of questions in our finance section about how people feel about their financial futures, and pretty high shares of Gen Z are concerned that the money that they have or will save will not last. A lot of Gen Zers agree that because of their money situation, they feel like they will never have the things that they want in life. And also, a high share of Gen Zers agree with the statement that I am just getting by financially. And a lot of Gen Z are constantly thinking about money. We ask them, like, how often are you thinking about money? I think like almost 5 in 10, or like 1 in 2 Gen Zers say constantly. And like, so it's obviously on their mind and it's something that they're worried about. But at the same time, I feel like these two are almost mutually exclusive things. They can be worried and they can feel bleak, but at the same time, they can also still be actively shopping, feel like they're over shopping, going into debt over shopping, and like regretting their shopping. And so, like, these competing, conflicting emotions, I think it's going to keep happening later into their lives. And they're also feeling like they're also competing on a really, really, really tough job market. Cost of living, right now, avian flu, egg prices, whatever it may be. And it just seems like there's a seeming sense that there's nothing stable for them to anchor against and work towards. And there's so many stories of even millennials who are not able to become homeowners and may never be able to become homeowners. And I think that that will be exacerbated when Gen Z become that age, like we mentioned before. And then, like, what is their lack of participation in the housing market mean for the rest of the economy when they become big spenders? Like, I'd love to hear from you on that. Like, if we wanted to do like fearless forecasts, which I love.
Yeah, actually, this has got me thinking a lot about the vibe session, and how economists are so perplexed about why so many things in the economy are performing well despite people feeling so bad. And I think maybe part of what's missing from this conversation, that I've never really put the pieces together before until this conversation, was that Gen Zers have a completely different attitude on the economy and behavior. And so it could be that, they have jobs, they have money, they are spending on things. And a lot of the success of the economy is because of spending has been so strong. So consumer spending and like PCE, those government measures have come in stronger than expected over the past couple of years. And they're also propping up GDP. So these traditional measures are not the best ways to think about how Gen Z is successful in this economy because they are spending despite maybe feeling like they don't have enough money and maybe they're just spending more than they should, quote unquote, because they're not saving for the future or they feel there's no point in saving for a mortgage if it's going to be when they're 40 years old. So I think my answer to that is a little loosey goosey, but it's more we need to think as these people age into their prime working years, as they become the people who are really the meat of the workers in the economy and are driving this economy forward, how we measure the health of it and the health of their finances as well as the health of the economy as a whole. Because it could be it's they're very different than boomers and very different than traditional consumers that we think about when we use traditional economic measures. That's my answer.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And I like that totally makes sense to me. And like one thing I'll add, and I don't want to like go on a totally different topic at the outset here, is that I do think that second jobs and side hustles and how Gen Z participates in the labor market is going to become even like a bigger topic of conversation. I know that like work culture conversations are starting to be not as prevalent these days after like a really tough initial couple of years of like the great resignation during peak pandemic. But I do think that we're starting to see potentially a generation of like not super engaged workers. Like we're already seeing in our data that Gen Z are more likely to be pursuing like quiet quitting behaviors. And while that's not totally specific to them at this point in time, I do think that if this trend continues, you're just going to get Gen Zer workers who are aging into seniority at their companies, but at the same time, not really be interested in pursuing the traditional paths of like careers that their predecessors definitely have. And this is one thing that is unique to Gen Z. Like, what does a career even mean? What does it mean to grow in a career? And what does like a traditional corporate 9 to 5 look like if so much of Gen Z are like pursuing side hustles? And oftentimes those side hustles are like funner things to do than their like 9 to 5 jobs. It's like a lot of Gen Zers are pursuing personal brands and building out social media presence. Like what like I don't know that there are like it's just going to look so different when they're in their prime working years in like 10, 15 years and they make up the vast majority of the workforce, but we're working with like a worker base that isn't super tied to a company or super aligned to companies values. And what does the job market look like then when you've got folks who don't even believe in the idea of like a traditional career?
Yeah, and that will definitely be exacerbated as just the landscape changes with all these technological improvements too with AI. More and more people having non-traditional careers like becoming an influencer or making income streams through online in various different ways or crypto or whatnot. There's just a whole new world out there, and so they will definitely be the ones to trailblaze that path, and it'll be interesting to see. But it'll definitely change the landscape as we know it today. So I'm curious to see how that is. Well, thanks so much, Amy. This has been a super fruitful discussion. I always learn so much from you, and I feel like we have great synergies with you giving me the perspective of the psychology behind the consumers at different generations and, bringing in that econ data. So thanks so much. Is there anything you want to add before we clock out here?
No, I don't think so. Thank you so much for the questions. I really loved chatting through all of this and bringing in like the econ data and that econ perspective. Hope to do this again in the future.